Okay, Onision, let's see if I can break this down for you as easily as I can. Yeah, this video may be long, but I don't give a shit. Evolution is not by no means something that's easily understandable. It is something that takes time to understand. It is a process of understanding in and of itself because it is a very complex and complicated issue with many social, religious, moral, and scientific ramifications. Now, your overall comments, in my opinion, are somewhat disastrous. I mean, consider this opinion.
I use chimpanzees as an example of why evolution doesn't make sense, that being that chimpanzees, as they are characterized today, not even characterized, as they are today, are almost identical to what our earlier ancestors looked like in all these scientific drawings or whatever. So how does that make any sense, right? If they're saying, oh, chimpanzees aren't our ancestors, but these monkeys that look exactly like chimpanzees are. What? If monkeys were dead, if they were all dead and we were the only ones left, then we would be saying that those are our ancestors. But the only reason that we don't say it is because of the fact that they're still here. That is stupid.
You clearly do not understand evolution. You clearly do not understand what the theory, the basics of the theory entail. I mean, your misunderstanding of the term mutant, for example.
So there's this theory that a frog crawled out of the water and had sex with some other creature, and some other creature came out, and then that creature had sex with other creatures, and then some other creature came out, and mutations kept occurring, which led to humanity, right? That's the most simplified version of evolution. Like, basically, we have mutations that occur when we have sex with something, and then our offspring are slightly different, and their offspring are slightly different, and so forth. My concern is, why is it that we had sex, and all these freak mutations end up freakishly being the same? Like, if it's a freak mutation, it's going to occur in a way that's different than everything else. Otherwise, it's not a freak, it's just a normal mutation, right? Why do we call it a freak mutation if it's so common? That doesn't make sense to me, okay? So, like, people say, oh, the earlier versions of us die off because they're weaker. Well, monkeys are supposed to be, you know, just like our earliest ancestors, and they're still alive, right? So how is it that the in-between us and those earlier versions of our ancestors are just like the modern monkeys? How is it they all died off because they're weaker? And my question is like, if we mutate, like that's the reason that we evolve, these freak mutations, why is it, like, let's say I have sex with someone and there's a mutation that occurs when I impregnate them and they have children, and those children are, you know, the more evolved versions of ourselves, and they go and have sex with other people, and their children are mutated and so forth and so on. It keeps going and going and going. I'm just one person with one other person in this big fucking world where that mutation occurred. Why is that freak mutation going to occur in Bill and John and James and all those other people around me also?
Now, these comments clearly demonstrate the fact that you are clearly lacking in your knowledge of the theory of evolution. Now, you do everything you can to discredit the opponent. This is a very, very funny logical fallacy in which you discredit the character of your opponent, or in this case, the character or image of the theory, as demonstrated by your promotion of this picture here. Now, you show this picture, and as said clearly by yourself.
And also, there's a picture. I'll link a picture in the description that is clearly racist, because, like, literally, the earlier ancestors, I have literally met black people that look just like him, and he's not primitive. He's not a primitive man. He's a modern man. There's nothing wrong with the way he looks, and yet scientists or whoever the fuck drew that make our earlier ancestors look like black people that are totally fucking fine. So it's just racist as shit.
It is racist. It's horrible. I mean, look at it. Look at it. It looks like a black person. You know many black people who look like this. Now let me show you what this black person really is. Now, Onision, I was thinking to myself exactly how in the hell am I going to reply to you on this? I mean, there are so many places to begin. So many places. I was one of those commentators on your initial video about evolution and its flaws. And I was one of the people that basically said, hey, do your research. And then I just waited a few days. I haven't been on the computer working a lot because, I have a real fucking job. And I come back a few days later to see, oh, hey, he has some more videos on this. And you know what? I haven't even watched one of them because they get stupider as they go on. It's like you literally take the creationist playbook from, 6 years ago on YouTube. And you go, yep, there you go. I mean, explain that. Chimpanzees are around. Oh, yeah. So evolution's not true, clearly. Because, look at it. Look at a chimp. What are you saying? I'm a chimp? You crazy? You saying I came from a chimp? Clearly, if you have any basic understanding of evolution, no, we did not come from monkeys. At least those monkeys. There are some proponents of evolution that say we are still monkeys. I prefer the term ape because it seems more dignified. And us and chimpanzees are basically cousins. Now, I thought to myself, okay, how can I respond to this effectively? And in all honesty, I can't. Because I would only be repeating what great people have said before me. People who are a lot more articulate than I am, use less local vernacular as me, and are more efficient in explaining it, because they're more scripted than I am. Now, I'm going to show off these videos. But first, I'm going to show the basics of Onision's argument. And it's going to include clips of him replying to people, so it may seem to you like I'm taking segments out, but no, I'm not. I will include the links below in the description box. You can go look at them, watch them yourself, waste 20 minutes of your time on them. I don't recommend it, because I'm going to be showcasing the basics here. After this, you will see kosher responses that were made years ago, in some cases. And it's funny, because they address every single point he brings up. And he's in 2012, and still saying this shit. On the internet, with all the information in the world at your fingertips, Onision, you still are persistently ignorant and passionately arrogant. And I just love it. I do. This is why I've subscribed to you again, after all. Because your idiocy is entertaining. So, without further ado.
Why is it that this evolution, allegedly, occurred in places that were similar to Africa in a different way than Africa? For instance, why is it our skin lightened when we went to India and parts of China and Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, South America, and so forth? Why is it that when we went to all these places, our skin tone changed, our height changed, our ability to run changed, our ability to jump changed, our physical appearance in general changed so much, even though the climate was so similar? My second question is why is it in the last 100 years that we've grown so much as far as technology goes? It's like we were placed here, and like it's like this. It's like they took a group of people from another planet, a bunch of different groups of people that mutated in a similar way, and then put them on this planet to start over. Because I swear to God, I could imagine going to a planet and seeing a bunch of fucking different versions of us in all different stages, and then finally it would make sense. I'm like, so that's really where we're from. We're from freak mutation land, where there's so many different freak mutations. And it actually has proof that all these freak mutations occurred, and that we were just the select ones that made it to this planet. Do you guys get what I'm saying? This is why it's all just so bullshit to me. Because it's like, freak mutations equal freaks everywhere. That's just reality, right? Because if it's a freak mutation, I've already explained it. You guys get it. If you don't get it at this point, I don't understand you. Because freak mutation, I'm just gonna repeat myself. Freak mutations are freaky. They're rare. They're not common in everyone. Okay? And that's the basis of evolution, right? Freak mutations. Look at us 300 years ago. Okay, we were using bows and arrows. All right? And we were using spears still 300 years ago. So you're going to tell me that these creatures that existed millions of years ago were using the same devices that we were using 300 years ago. What the fuck took them so long to change? I don't get it. I don't understand in the slightest. And I want you guys to tell me why it is that we've evolved so much as of late. Developed the computer, the cell phone, the television, the car, and so forth. And yet, those earlier versions of ourselves were complete fucking idiots, to put it bluntly. Like, how the fuck did they not figure shit out faster? You know? If you're able to sharpen a stick, if you're able to start a fire, you should be able to learn at a pretty decent rate over a period of millions of years. Millions of years. I want you guys to seriously think about how long millions of years is. It's ridiculous, the idea that those are us millions of years ago. I would believe it if they didn't have weapons and if they didn't have fire. I would believe it, because when you are in that animal state, you're basically going nowhere. You're just doing random shit all day. You know, you're never really growing.
One of the first things to understand is that the theory of evolution is not concerned with the origins or development of the universe, or how life was first begun. It explains how different living organisms have developed and diversified since life first appeared on Earth. Even if life on Earth had been initiated by some kind of divine or alien intervention, that wouldn't affect the evidence for evolution, which, incidentally, is accepted by people who believe in one or more gods, as well as those who don't. To start with some observations that are easily appreciated, we know that physical characteristics of parents are inherited by offspring, and that through the artificial process of selective breeding, many traits exhibited by a given lifeform can be exaggerated in later generations. This can be achieved fairly simply by mating together individuals that exhibit those traits most strongly and repeating this process with successive generations. Breed only from horses with good competition records and their offspring will tend to perform well also. Breed only from aggressive dogs and their offspring will tend to be aggressive. Many who happily acknowledge this kind of artificial selection are the same people who label evolution impossible or a fairy tale, and yet natural selection, one of the major mechanisms that drives evolution, requires no magical suspension or violation of physical laws. It merely states that traits also emerge and reproductive opportunities are also limited because of factors other than human influence. If a greyhound breeder selects only the fastest dogs for breeding stock, and in the wild female birds of paradise favour males that have the most impressive plumage, so that only those males get the opportunity to reproduce, then both nature and the greyhound breeder are favouring certain individuals for reproducing offspring and passing on their genetic information to the next generation. Before I say more about natural selection, I want to mention another commonly misunderstood term, mutation. Many think that when biologists talk about mutation, they're referring only to dramatic malformations like animals with extra limbs or heads, or far-fetched scenarios like dogs producing cats, or even morphing into cats. These are misconceptions. Mutations are simply changes in genetic variation within a population, brought about by insertions, deletions, and recombinations of the DNA sequence. But mutation isn't the only cause of variation, because it's not only the DNA sequence that's important to evolution. Epigenetic studies, for example, show that genes can be switched on or off, and that this genetic activation or inhibition can be inherited and expressed in later generations. Most variations are neutral and have no impact on an organism's survival, accumulating naturally over successive generations in what's known as genetic drift, the effects of which are far more dramatic in smaller populations.
In the Disney cartoons, everyone knows that Mickey is a mouse and Donald is a duck, and we'd probably understand that even if we never heard their last names. But people often get confused about what Goofy is supposed to be. According to Disney, Goofy is a dog, and he looks as much like a real animal as Mickey or Donald do. The reason Goofy doesn't look like a dog to us is because Pluto is a dog too, but Pluto only has the behavior of a dog, and that creates a conceptual disconnect when we try to understand how Goofy and Pluto can both belong to the same species. This may be one reason why many people have a problem trying to understand how humans can be classified as a subset of the family of apes. But however one defines what a human is, that definition has to begin with the biology of an ape, onto which we may add our uniquely specific traits. The study of physical anthropology has many points of confusion regardless of one's level of education or acceptance of human evolution. The problem isn't just the modern meaning of the word ape, for the definition has changed over time, but also what it means to be human and how modern man relates to the rest of humanity, meaning other, now extinct species which most people don't think about. When I was a kid, it seemed like scientists were the only ones who didn't believe that dinosaurs were giant lizards who lived at the same time as men, because the common concept of the prehistoric world was more inspired by scenes of Raquel Welch than on any actual science, and this imagery was also marketed for children. So I had this entire set of snapped-together plastic pieces, including some of the later editions like the woolly mammoths, Styracosaurus, and the Eocene terror bird, none of which lived at the same time. I remember complaining about that and having to explain that modern men and Neanderthals did live at the same time then, because so many of the adults that I knew thought that Neanderthals were supposed to have been those half-human ape men who the evolutionists believe we allegedly evolved from. I had to explain that no scientist ever suggested that Homo sapiens descended from Homo neanderthalensis, that instead both races were like cousins with the same grandfather. Culturally, intellectually, and anatomically modern humans evidently emerged in Africa within the last 100,000 years or so, and then followed their ancestors in waves of migrations out to the rest of the world. Neanderthals originated in Western Asia at least 250,000 years earlier and then moved into Europe, and over time their definitive characteristics became more recognizably exaggerated. Their less distinctive proto-Neanderthal ancestors were themselves descended from Homo erectus. This species had many phenotypic subsets known by several different names and were already widespread throughout the tropics of Asia and Africa, where the earliest known member of our species still shared a blend of subtle traits associated with both erectus and Neanderthals. For anyone who still doesn't understand how two sibling species could arise from a common ancestor when neither would have met the other, it works like this. There may be several different family lines cohabitating one area at one time. Over many generations, some of these will eventually diminish or die out, while others proliferate more abundantly, so that eventually all the modern denizens of that place can only trace their genealogy back a few generations before they find that they all converge on the same ancestry the rest of the way back. The same applies to the macroevolutionary scale as well. This is why the further back you trace any two visibly related lineages, the more their recessed ancestors will resemble each other, because at one time they were the same thing and have each grown their own way since. The same pattern is reflected in the aging process. This is why the young of two closely related species look more alike than the adults do. Remember also that you can't look back on your own life and determine the hour when you had no more childish traits but were a fully mature adult. For the same reason, even if you could view all your consecutive ancestors over 1,000,000 generations, it would still be impossible to positively identify any one individual as the first human. All you would find throughout that time would be communities where individuals show only subtle variations from each other. You would not be able to recognize the year when those once unique traits came to dominate the whole tribe, nor could you ever find one generation in which no one could still interbreed with anyone from the generation before. You could find a collective of chemically interfertile contemporaries whose genetics had become so unique as to be incompatible with some of those who were 1,000 generations distant. Because life is not as static as folks imagine. Living designs are a fluid dynamic. When a population is divided in complete genetic isolation, unique distinctions will arise in each group and the two will grow increasingly apart. The longer this goes on, the less likely it will be to bridge the widening gap and produce viable offspring. Chemical fertility isn't always the determining factor here either. There are instances where two species can interbreed but prefer not to and usually won't under normal circumstances. That may be the case here. Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis are very closely related, yet there was little intermingling, only about 10%. People living today show no more than 4% Neanderthal DNA, if at all, and the Neanderthal genome reveals no contribution from early sapiens, so at the very least, Neanderthals may be our best example of another breed of human. Remember that a breed or subspecies is determined by a suite of definitive traits which are shared by every member of a given lineage and which is not present in any member of a sister group. Despite cultural contentions of prejudiced politics, human diversity has not reached this level since our divergence with Neanderthals hundreds of thousands of years ago. While we may argue over whether Neanderthals had yet met all the criteria required to qualify as another species, there is no doubt but that hobbits definitely were. Homo floresiensis was unambiguously a different species even if they could interbreed with us, which they probably could, yet almost certainly didn't. While all hobbits found so far are less than 80,000 years old, their morphology implies that the race must be much older, diverging from our line at least 1.5 million years ago. Because every one of them found so far shares the same primitive and definitive characteristics, many of which are not found in any of us or Neanderthals either. If Homo erectus was our grandfather and Neanderthals are our first cousins, then hobbits are our second or even third cousins, because they still have traits in their wrists and ankle bones which were already lost in erectus and all subsequent descendants. Hobbits, then, could not have descended from erectus. They must have diverged prior to them, perhaps from Homo habilis, one of the earliest humans and the last one still having skeletal features which are otherwise found only in australopiths and non-human apes like chimpanzees. Hobbits were definitely not the same species as Homo sapiens or Homo erectus, but they are still generally considered human, although they were as distantly related as it is possible for another human to be. They had the smallest proportionate brain size of any human species, but the shapes of the face and the skull were definitely human, and they evidently used fire and made stone tools which are uniquely associated with them, being unlike those made by any other hominin. Of course, the Hobbit's Indonesian location implies that waves of hominin migration out of Africa must have begun earlier than previously predicted. Knowing this, it is not surprising that primitive human skulls, estimated to be 1.8 million years old, were found in Western Asia. Neither is it surprising that these skulls were morphologically intermediate between Homo habilis and later erectus. These were labeled H. georgicus, or said to be H. ergaster, or something similar. The various phenotypes named in human evolution are often difficult to distinguish. Some paleoanthropologists consider a few of these names to be significant only in cataloging the varieties and migration of early men. In this view, everything from Pithecanthropus through Homo antecessor may just be subtle varieties in a continuous chronological sequence of the same interconnected species, and the transition from them to us is blurred by the abundance of intermediate fossils throughout that series. Of course, that's not the public opinion, largely because the news media love to sensationalize scientific discoveries. It seems that a story can't be interesting if it isn't made controversial to stir an emotional reaction. For example, Denisova hominin was declared to be a unique human species distinct from Neanderthals and modern humans based on genetic analysis, even though that analysis actually showed them to be related to both Neanderthals and the ancestors of modern Melanesians. Confusing controversies evoke more interest among the ignorant than anything that is properly understood and accurately portrayed. So, of course, creationists will seize any perceived controversy and will often manufacture them themselves. For example, a young Earth creationist once presented me with a list of mind quotations, including this one attributed to Richard Leakey, allegedly from an unidentified documentary. I was able to look up the other quotes to show how they were each incomplete statements, deceptively edited, out of context, or otherwise erroneously and deliberately misrepresented, but the PBS documentary wasn't available anymore. So I wrote to Dr. Leakey in Kenya, and he answered me saying that creationists were dishonest quote miners of astonishing stupidity. For example, look at this stool sample from Answers in Genesis University, who gave a 2-hour lie-a-thon at a church down the street from my house.
So the first we'll look at here is Lucy, popular. Drawing on the left, the sculpture on the left, depicting what Lucy's supposed to look like, allegedly, from the bones on the right. That's what they really found. And it's amazing how you can make feet without fossils of feet.
Of course, this skid mark in your tidy whities is only looking at the very first of this species ever found. Since 1974, we found some with feet included. In fact, we found hundreds more individuals since then, just from this one species alone, to say nothing of the dozen or so species which the gullible believers can neither account for nor honestly dismiss.
As they've discovered more fossils of this type of creature, doesn't look anything like that. Doesn't look anything like Lucy. And even evolutionists themselves, they're the ones that do a lot of this research, so I just kind of use them all the time. They'll say, nope, Lucy didn't look like that. In reality, she was just looked more like an ape that climbed and swung in the trees. Looked basically some kind of ape-like creature. Did not look like that at all. And they know that. And what's worse is it's still in the museum that looks like that.
That's because they did look like that, you facially flatulating religitard, as I have already explained.
Australopithecus afarensis proved to be a fully bipedal ape whose hands, feet, teeth, pelvis, skull, and other physical details were exactly what creationists challenged us to find, yet they're still pretending we never found it.
Our species Homo sapiens is the single remaining member of the genus Homo. Our buddies Homo erectus and Homo habilis and Homo neanderthalis bought the farm a long time ago. So these days, all us Homo sapiens are pretty different from even our closest living relatives in the animal kingdom, the chimps and bonobos. Humans are a species, a specific type of organism that's different from all of the other types of organisms out there. But what is it that makes us human? Well, we're a specific type of animal called a primate. Monkeys, apes, lemurs, and tarsiers are also primates. Unless you're Sacha Baron Cohen or something, most of us are lacking significant body hair. We're bipedal, meaning we stand on 2 feet, and we've got these huge, enormous brains that allow us to do all kinds of stuff like talk real good and solve complicated problems and write bad poetry during adolescence. And, also like figure out how little we can get away with tipping a mediocre waiter at a restaurant without seeming like a total prick. That, my friends, is something that giraffes rarely have to deal with. But being a species is more than just having a bunch of stuff in common. Instead, we describe a species as a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Seems pretty simple, right? 2 of the same species that can produce blah, 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 blah. Hey, pay attention! That last part is important. The 2 organisms need to be able to produce fertile offspring. It seems like it would be enough for organisms of the same species to be able to make babies, but those babies need to be able to make babies too. Now, it turns out 2 animals of a different species can sometimes technically have a baby. Take, for instance, the noble liger, Napoleon Dynamite's favorite animal, which I would know because I had the very best Napoleon Dynamite costume in the United States for Halloween in 2005. But I didn't just bring up ligers to brag. A liger is what happens when a male lion and a female tiger have a little cub. Only it's not very little because a liger is generally larger than both of its parents, and ligers are sterile, which leads us to our understanding of what makes a species. Lions and tigers are different species because they don't produce fertile offspring together. We know that through evolution, or the change in heritable characteristics of a species across generations, new species have formed in the past, and they continue to develop all the time. It's tough to nail down every single way that this process that we call speciation can happen, but we know of at least a couple ways that species evolve into other species, and they both involve one requirement: reproductive isolation, meaning that 2 populations of the same species can no longer mate together successfully. Note that I said successfully. One way populations can become isolated from each other is that they can mate, but their offspring aren't fertile or viable. Ligers are a good example of this. So are mules. They're the product of a male donkey and a female horse. And unlike lions and tigers, donkeys and horses don't even have the same number of chromosomes. So even though the donkey sperm can fertilize the horse egg, the mule won't have the genetic instructions it needs to produce its own sex cells. This kind of isolation is called post-zygotic isolation because the parents can form a zygote together, but after that, it's all over for their lineage. Other examples of post-zygotic isolation include pairings of species that always lead to miscarriage or no development of the embryo at all, or things that produce like big fetuses that kill the mother at birth. The other type of isolation is pre-zygotic, meaning that the isolation happened between groups of the same species before an egg even thought about getting fertilized. This can include stuff like behavioral changes within a species, like when birds of the same species start singing 2 different songs to attract mates, or when one group of a species that does all of its business in the daytime gradually becomes nocturnal so that the 2 groups never end up hanging out at the same time. Pre-zygotic isolation can also be geographic, meaning simply that populations are separated by great distances or physical barriers so that they can no longer get together and bump uglies. When one species diverges into 2 different species because of geographic isolation, it's called allopatric speciation. Allopatric coming from the Greek for different countries. The 2 populations of the species end up evolving differently because the conditions are different on each side of this river here. For instance, it might be colder on one side of the river, so the animals on this side grow thicker and more luxurious coats because those guys just do better over there. They probably also put on thicker layers of fat and change their behavior and accumulate a bunch of other possibly random changes. Meanwhile, on the warm side of the river, these animals also accumulate changes and lose some fur, add a bunch of sweat glands. Given enough time and given a complete lack of gene flow between the 2 populations, thick-coated animals will eventually only be able to breed with other thick-coated animals and sweaty animals with sweaty animals. This propagation of specific traits based on how kick-ass those traits make the animal that has them is called natural selection, and a guy named Charles Darwin or Chuck Darwin or Chucky D to his friends, was the one who let us know what was up with natural selection and how it can lead to allopatric speciation. Now, stop me if you heard this one before, but Darwin visited the Galapagos Islands in the 1830s. So Darwin was obsessed with barnacles, but that did not keep him from noticing the finches, which were actually misidentified by him as grosbeaks on each island, which were all pretty similar to the finches on other islands and very similar to the ones in the mainland of South America. But they were also obviously their own species. Darwin believed that the process that led to these finches becoming separate species was so slow that we couldn't actually witness the process, we just had to take his word for it. Now, for a long time after Darwin made these observations, allopatric speciation was the main explanation for how species diverge, but today, we know that that's not the whole truth. Now, we've got lots of newfangled DNA testing and other special gadgetry that tells us that one species can diverge into two without being geographically separated, but instead when they're reproductively isolated in some other way. This is called sympatric speciation, meaning same country speciation, and it also means that it's time for a trip to the chair. So here's a little biological love story for all you romantics out there. Peter and Rosemary Grant, two British evolutionary biologists, they are in fact a married couple, have since the early 1970s been spending 6 months of each year together on a secluded island in the Galapagos studying Darwin's finches, trying to catch them in the act of evolving. These are, mind you, the same animals that Darwin studied and the ones that he said were evolving at an imperceptibly slow pace. The island in the Galapagos that the Grants hang out on is called Daphne Major, and when they started their research in 1973, it was occupied by two different finch species, the medium ground finch and the cactus finch. But in 1981, another finch arrived on Daphne Major from a nearby island. It was a ground finch-cactus finch hybrid, and it was a whole lot bigger than either of the local finches. Its beak was also extra wide, and its song was like a mashup of the Germs ground finches sang on its home island and the ones sung on Daphne Major. So the newcomers set to work crooning to the local ground finch ladies and eventually landed one. The Grants followed the descendants of these two birds for the next 28 years. But after about 4 generations, Daphne Major experienced a severe drought which killed many of the finches. There were only 2 surviving descendants of that one immigrant finch, sort of like cousins of each other basically, and they mated with each other, and that seems to have set the stage for speciation to occur. The descendants of these 2 survivors sang a very distinctive song that was learned from their parents, which was different from the other Daphne Major finches. Gradually, as the finch population on the island rebounded, the hybrid finches, the great-great-great-great-grand chicks of that one bird, began mating exclusively with each other. In December of 2009, the Grants announced that since the drought, the lineage of that one immigrant ground finch has been genetically isolated from the other local finches on the island. So that, my friends, is both super romantic and also an excellent example of super quick sympatric speciation in action.
Many who don't understand evolution try to discredit it by equating it with pure accident. But it's not pure accident that camouflage, hooves, petals, antennae, fins, wings, eyes, and roots have evolved in the natural world. All these physical characteristics have served specific functions in contributing towards different organisms' reproductive success. And clearly, if the organisms that exhibit these characteristics manage to reproduce, they perpetuate their genetic information, including the information for the characteristics, in the next generation. Even attributes that give no particular advantage to an organism can still be favoured if they're associated with other attributes that do. For example, having leaves that appear green isn't necessarily beneficial to plants, but chlorophyll is green and chlorophyll is beneficial, because it enables plants to gain energy from light by photosynthesis. When it comes to beneficial characteristics, there's no one-size-fits-all. Bulk may be a great advantage for a walrus wanting to dominate its rivals, but it would be a distinct disadvantage to a spider monkey that's adapted to a life of swinging nimbly through trees. Again, it's no accident that walruses have evolved to be bulky and spider monkeys have evolved slender, supple limbs. These physical attributes have helped them to operate in their respective environments, to survive and compete for reproduction. People who say that evolution is all about impossibly unlikely accidents and blind luck often like to claim that the probability of life forms evolving is the same as the probability of winning the jackpot on a one-armed bandit hundreds of times in a row, or even thousands, depending on how creative they're feeling with numbers. But miraculous accidents are the opposite of what evolution is about. If we're going to use the one-armed bandit analogy, then evolution presses the hold button on almost all symbols on every pull of the lever. Starting with a word, we only need to change one of its letters to turn it into a new word. Changing one letter from this word results in further new words. And if we carry on repeating the process, we can produce words that have no letters in common with the original. Dramatic change can be achieved one small step at a time, and this is what happens with evolution, except that with evolution, countless mostly minute changes have accumulated over millions of years. If members of a given species become geographically isolated from each other, each group may end up having to respond to very different environments and predators and adapt to very different ways of gathering food. Any genetic variation will no longer be shared throughout the whole population, but only within each group, so that genetic drift and natural selection may lead to the emergence of two distinct populations, which after a given period of time may no longer be related closely enough to interbreed. The theory of evolution does not say that organisms from one species population suddenly produce organisms from another. Dogs don't produce cats. Nor does the theory of evolution say that individual organisms change species. Individual apes don't morph into humans. Nor again does the theory of evolution demand the existence of crocoducks. The crocoduck argument implies that evolution requires all possible combinations of known species to exist. If you require a crocoduck to exist, you require a rhinopus to exist. If you require these to exist, you require a rhino-crocoduckpus to exist, and so on towards infinity. There are millions of species to combine and recombine and recombine. But the theory of evolution says something very different. It doesn't reward every possible combination of physical features. Even once successful species are being driven to extinction all the time. Evolution rewards only whatever is most efficient at reproducing itself. No particular species is guaranteed to emerge through evolution. If you claim that the theory of evolution says any of the following, it shows either that you simply don't understand what evolution is, which can be remedied with a little reading from trustworthy sources, or that you're being deliberately dishonest and trying to create confusion about science in the hope that this will lead to more support for your position. Either way, attempts to make evolution seem like a fairy tale by both the misinformed and the dishonest will continue to be exposed. The real fairy tale is the claim that evolution has anything whatsoever to do with dogs giving birth to cats, crocoducks, and animals morphing into other species or popping into existence through pure accident. If you speak to anyone who knows about and accepts evolution, you'll find that these ideas are as ridiculous to them as they are to the anti-evolutionist. And if you're a reasonable person, this should also make you wonder very seriously why, if these people are so confident they can prove evolution's impossible, they need to concoct such demonstrably false propaganda about it.
Look, now that it's all over, I don't expect any of you to be at this point in the video, but if you are, I want you to understand one thing, especially if this is to you, Onision, especially if you made it to this part in the video. If you could swallow that fucking ego of yours and make it this far, you have been told what evolution is. You should now have a basic understanding of what evolution is. All of your main points have been addressed. All of your main points, as exacerbated as they've been in the past, have been treated equally, but because you don't have any substantial amount of evidence, just that fact alone, that you cannot prove the alienist theory of aliens implanting us here, putting us here from another planet, because there is enough proof showing that we've been here this whole time. Just the fact that I've demonstrated to you that we are not from chimps. We are in the same subspecies of ape. Kind of. But we are not the same. We are not descendants of them. And even then, even if that were to be the case, it doesn't disprove evolution, because that happens to species, as demonstrated by the QualiaSoup video. Evolution is a fluid process, in the words of Aronra. It is a process that takes many, many generations. And yet you write it off because, well, I see monkeys, I see people, like come from each other, Because they're both here. For someone who claims to be an atheist, someone who claims to be a skeptic, you remind me of me 2 years ago, well, nearly 2 years ago now, when I was 17 years old, when I didn't fully understand evolution, and I wrote it off as a theory, because, well, it's just a theory. If you took the time, dedicated just a morsel of it, to understanding this theory, then you would also understand that you were wrong. Just as I understood that I am wrong. Because you're attacking a straw man. You are creating an enemy and then destroying it systematically. It's easy for you to do that, of course, especially to your audience of, I'm assuming, young teenage girls. Now, I personally don't think you're a stupid person, Onision. I think you are a manipulative person who probably suffers from histrionic personality disorder. That's neither here nor there. It really isn't. But to all of his fans, to all of you who were proponents of those ideas, understand that you are not supported. That your ideas are not supported. Understand that in order to truly destroy an idea, you must understand that idea. And if that idea proves to be sound, if it is factually backed, if it is observable, if it can be proved substantially, then you must come up with something better. Until then, shut the fuck up and learn. It is not hard. And to anyone else who disagrees with this opinion, fuck you. It's people like you that spread ignorance and arrogance. It's people like you that promote violence because that's what stupid people do. It's people like you who promote half-assed short-term solutions because that's what stupid people do. It is you who simply write off everything as impressionable, who write off everything as, oh, well, he thinks it's a truth, therefore it is, because that's what stupid people do. Now, if you care about my opinion, I don't care. If you agree with me, splendid. If you think that what I'm saying is wrong, tell me. Because unlike people like Onision, I will listen to you. I will accept your criticism. Now, in all honesty, there is no need for discourse like this. There is no need for people like me and people like you, Onision, to have a discussion like, I mean, it's not really a discussion, because we're not discussing anything, but there shouldn't be two contrary viewpoints in this manner being approached like this. It shouldn't have to be some drama whoring, conflict, uprising of nonsensical bullshit. It should be, okay, look, I think there's a problem with this, and people go, hey, this, and you go, no, no, there's no reason for that. If people bring up points, you don't necessarily go only by what they say. They shouldn't have to link you or show you to a book in a library of every single shred of evidence. There's no need for it. If you are truly concerned with this issue, and if you truly want to know more about it, you would, and you will, fucking learn on your own. It's that simple. So, with that being said, I'm the Actual Snacks. Peace.